Thank you, Karen. Luke and I are going to kind of tag team this. You do have the presentation in your packet of materials. I apologize in advance. I don't normally do such a wordy PowerPoint, but this is such a very important topic, and it's very statutory oriented. So we wanted you to have as much of that information in writing as possible, so you don't have to take quite as many notes. This is one of the cornerstones of public office, this topic. Open door law is extremely important. For any of you that are statutory legal geeks that you want to actually know what the code site is, I'm going to go ahead and give you that so that you can always look it up. It's Indiana Code 5-14-1.5. We do want this to be kind of interactive. As I mentioned, we're going to go through these slides. Luke has a lot of examples and stories and can answer a lot of questions. So we'd like to go ahead and let you ask questions as you have them instead of waiting till the end. Before we jump into it, I think Luke would like to give you kind of a summary overview of his office.
Sure. Happy holidays. Thanks for having me here at your conference this morning. It's good for me to get in front of people face to face. I travel the state and do these kinds of, oh, is this not on? Can you hear me a little better? Can you hear me in the back okay? All right, great. So I travel the state and give these kinds of talks pretty regularly. This is my fifth or sixth this week, so I'm kind of sick of hearing myself talk. So I'll hand it over to Lisa for most of it, but I just wanted to kind of introduce myself and give you some context as to who I am and why I'm here and how I can be a resource for you. The Office of the Public Access Counselor is only about 20 years old, so we haven't been around for that long, but our statutory duty is to interpret both the Indiana Open Door Law as well as the Access to Public Records Act and any other access law that is scattered throughout Indiana code, of which there are several. And public access intersects with almost every aspect of public business and even private business at some times. So we are small. We only have two people in our office, myself and my deputy, Chris. Chris is back there. So if you call our office for a question or an interpretation, a hypothetical situation, or even a real life scenario that you just need guidance on, you're going to get either myself or Chris. And we do cover the whole state, both the executive branch of state government all the way down to the smallest township level. So we are here for you. We do have an adversarial complaint process, and that's probably the more high-profile aspect of what we do, but we don't look at it necessarily as a bad thing, as adversarial. We take that opportunity to educate and to teach. It just so happens that comes in the form of an administrative complaint. So someone from your community may take exception with what you do at some course in your tenure, and they may complain to our office. Now, if you get that dreaded complaint form from us that say, "Hey, we need an answer within 2 weeks," don't look at that as us trying to play gotcha or trying to play cop as far as public access issues go. To us, it's more of an opportunity for a dialogue. And if there has been some kind of deviation from what the law says, very rarely do I find in the course of what I do that it's ever intentional, or blatantly so. Sometimes it's just a misinterpretation of the law, or it's at odds with my expectations or the expectations of those statutes, and it's an opportunity to work that out. But certainly that's a small part of what we do. We try to make ourselves as accessible and as approachable as possible. So I'm confident that Lisa's going to do a great job walking you through the open door law. But if there is any other questions as to that, or public records, or any other type of transparency or access issue, we are here to help. I brought some of our public access handbooks, which are published by our office as well as the Office of the Attorney General. I put a small stack out front. It's not going to be enough for each of you to take home, but we also publish that digitally as well on our website. Just Google Indiana Public Access Counselor. It's going to be the first hit that comes up. Our website's a pretty good resource as well in a pinch, but again, phone calls, emails, we're receptive to all of those things and look forward to hearing from you as you go about this new adventure in public service. So I'll hand it back over to Lisa.
All right. Thank you. This concept is important enough that there's some form of this concept in about all 50 states, and it's often referred to as sunshine laws, if you've heard that term. Basically, it's let's shed some light on what decisions government is making, and let's not have those behind closed doors. Let's have them open and out in the sunshine. The underlying public purpose is to make governmental actions open and accessible to the public. And the statute specifically says that this is to be liberally construed. So in other statutes, it may not be, you don't have that language, but the courts have said it's going to be liberally construed. This was important enough to the legislature that they actually put that language in this statute. So when in doubt, the access to the meeting is the preferred outcome, and I think that's a lot where Luke's office comes in. So as we go through the requirements, there's going to be some key terms that you need to understand. For example, you're going to hear meeting, 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 meeting. Well, what is a meeting? Not everything is a meeting, so we need to know at the beginning what that is. So under the statute, a meeting is a gathering of a majority of a governing body of a public agency for the purpose of taking final action upon public business. So governing body could be your Board of Commissioners, your county council, but we'll get into other entities that are also governing bodies. An executive session is still a meeting, but it's just a meeting in which the public is excluded. However, the governing body may allow certain public to enter that are integral to the discussion that they are going to have. There are to be no decisions, which we'll talk about. So what is not a meeting? And these are important as well. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it's an important list. So any social or chance gathering not intended to avoid the chapter. A county Christmas party. You may have 2 or all 3 of the Board of Commissioners there. You may have a majority of your council members there. That is not considered a meeting for purposes of this statute. Any on-site inspection of a project or a program that's ongoing that the county has, you are allowed to go out and inspect projects, and there may be a majority of a council or commissioners there, but that is also not a meeting under this statute. Attending meetings of organizations devoted to better government. Association of Indiana Counties. So this meeting, if there are 3 county commissioners sitting together at a table, you are not considered to be having a governing body meeting for public business. And also an orientation on roles and responsibilities of government officials. So newly elected officials conference that you're sitting at. So you're covered in 2 of those already. So none of those are considered meetings for purposes of this statute. And you may get that question if you're out at a social gathering and there's 4 council members out of 7. Someone may come up to you and say, how can all of you be here? You have a majority. So that's a specific exception to the definition of meeting. So what is a governing body? The obvious ones I mentioned are Board of Commissioners and the County Council. But a governing body is 2 or more individuals who are the board, commission, council, or other body of a public agency that takes official action upon public business. So this could be your drainage board, your county redevelopment commission. If you've issued lease rental bonds and you've got a building corporation, for the purposes of this statute, that is a governing body, and their meetings are subject to this statute. Also, any committees that are appointed directly by a governing body or its presiding officer to which authority has been given to take official action or delegated public business. So if you have council committees, I know like the city of Indianapolis, they have council committees that hold meetings in between all the council meetings, and they take public comment and they make decisions and recommendations, and they're also subject to this statute. A governing body is not a gathering of your agency employees that are conducting internal staff operations. Okay. So what does official action mean? Because I think a lot of people just think that means voting. But official action under the statute is receiving information, deliberating, making recommendations, establishing policies, making any decisions, or taking final action. And final action specifically means taking a vote on a particular issue, resolution, ordinance, order, whatever that may be. And public business means any function upon which the public agency is empowered or authorized to take official action. So it's pretty broad, and you should always, again, err on the side of being subject to this statute. So what are some of the general requirements? With few exceptions, all meetings of the governing bodies of the public agencies must be open at all times for the public to observe and record them, should they choose to record them. From my perspective, and I would love to hear Luke's take on this does not mean that you are required to allow the public to speak, and I'll give an exception here in a moment, or allow the public to ask questions. Executive sessions, or not executive sessions, but there are some statutes and some actions that require a public hearing in which you give notice published in the paper at least 10 days ahead of time, and you are required to allow the public to speak at that meeting. You're not, it's kind of interpretation as to whether you're required to answer questions of the public in a public hearing. But in a regular meeting, you're not required to allow the public to speak. I know a lot of different governing bodies have a policy to always allow the public to speak if they choose to do so, and you can certainly do that. One thing you might consider, though, is also limiting that to agenda items, because there are examples of the public kind of taking over a meeting that was really convened for a certain specific agenda item, but they want to argue and complain about something completely different, and so it kind of takes over the whole issue. So just that's something to keep in mind. And I don't know, Luke, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, if I could jump in with a couple examples. As far as the public comment forum, I think it's generally a good idea for governing bodies to allow the public to express their support or opposition to an initiative, but that, like Lisa mentioned, it's not required. A lot of times I will get a complaint from a constituent who says, but wait a minute, isn't it my First Amendment right to speak to the board and to have my questions answered? No, it's not. There's a time, place, manner restriction even on political speech. And so the time, place, and manner for that is not necessarily within the context of a public meeting. Those meetings are there for the government to get their jobs done. If they want to give the public an opportunity to weigh in, they certainly can. But that should be a structured situation. You know, a lot of times there will be policies that says, okay, you can speak on an agenda item, first come, first served. You're limited to 3 to 5 minutes, and that's that. I advise a state board, and their meeting was just this past Tuesday, and I went to that meeting, and they have a problem with constituents showing up to protest their meetings. It's a relatively non-controversial board, but for whatever reason, they've taken it upon themselves month after month to show up with air horns and signs and chants and things like that. That's not appropriate for a public meeting. They can go outside on the State House lawn and do it all day long, but not within the 4 walls of that meeting. That's not appropriate. And they tried to do it again, and that's why they have me come to their meetings to kind of tamp that down a little bit. And just one other thing, before I give it back over to Lisa, I'll give you a real-world example from this week about the official action versus final action conversation. So technically, anytime any kind of official action on public business is taken by a majority of a governing body, it triggers the open door law requirements. And like Lisa mentioned, official action includes pretty much everything. Whether you're talking to each other about a specific issue or receiving information about it, if you're doing it as a majority of a body, it's triggered. So unfortunately, I have to throw my home county under the bus a little bit here, because Johnson County experienced some election issues in November. And so their election board has been meeting ever since to discuss how to fix it next time, which is a worthwhile discussion, no mistake about it. And election boards typically have 3 members. Well, 2 or 3, in some instances of them, were meeting and not noticing their meetings, not providing the public an opportunity to observe that conversation. And so the local newspaper kind of called them out on it. And they had some quotes for me where I said, all right, here are the parameters of the law. This is what you have to do. And their response, unfortunately, was, well, we didn't vote. We didn't make any binding decision. We didn't take final action. Well, it really doesn't matter that you take those kinds of final steps. Everything up to that point still qualifies as a public meeting. And so I'll kind of analogize that later a little bit, but I'll hand it over to Lisa for now.
Yeah, and also a secret ballot may not be taken. Anytime you're at a public meeting and you are voting, it must be more like a roll call vote, so the public can see who is voting for, who is voting against. So you can't do secret ballots on that type of thing. So what kind of notice requirements do we have of our meetings? Well, public notice of the date, time, and place must be given for all meetings of a governing body, and that must occur at least 48 hours prior to the time of the meeting. And that does not include Saturdays, Sundays, or legal holidays, and we give you the statute site there for what are considered legal holidays for purposes of this statute. It does not apply, you can reconvene a regular meeting. So if you're having a meeting and then you have the public there and you decide that you need some more time on an issue, so you're going to reconvene that meeting or maybe reconvene that public hearing, as long as you, in that meeting, and then in your minutes, you give the date, time, location of the convenance, that's probably not a word, of the reconvened meeting, then you don't have to re-notice it in the 48-hour notice. You cannot reconvene a meeting or adjourn a meeting to go into executive session and then come back. They don't allow you to do that. That's seen as, I think, policy-wise, that doesn't feel right from the public's perspective. It looks like you wanted to go discuss the issue, in the other room for a while and then come back and vote. So you cannot do that to go into an executive session. So notice, where do you post the notice? You post it at the principal office of the public agency. So if it's the county council, it's the county courthouse most likely. If you don't have such an office, then it's going to be posted where the meeting is going to be held. Notice of regular meetings need only be given once each year, except that an additional notice has to be given if the time, date, or place of the regular meeting has changed. Again, this doesn't apply to executive sessions. You always have to, you can't do a blanket notice that every month we're going to have an executive session, and you'll understand why here in a little bit. But for some reason, and someone in here may know why, I don't know from AIC or Luke, the county councils have a specific statute. This doesn't apply to cities and towns. They have a specific statute that says you only have 2 regular meetings in a year, every other meeting of the council. So even if you meet at the same time every month, the second Tuesday of the month at 7 p.m. in the same location, that's still considered a special meeting and requires not only the 48-hour written notice, but also a 1-day published notice in the newspaper. And I made note here, legislative change, question mark? I mean, I don't know what the policy decision behind that only applying to county councils is, but that to me is a way to be tripped up when you're just talking about a meeting that you have the same month or the same day of every month. As far as public notice of the meeting, how do you give it to the media? You are required to notify the media that have requested to be notified, And this is an annual request that they have to make by December 31st. Let's say if they want it to apply to 2019, then by December 31st of this year, they need to file a written request, and I believe that's with the auditor. I believe that would be with the county auditor. A written request saying that they want to receive notice of all governing body meetings or a particular governing body meeting, and then you'll need to do that. Note the 48-hour notice does not apply to emergency meetings, but I will tell you that that is narrowly defined as to what is an emergency. It's actual or threatened injury to person or property, and actual or threatened disruption of governmental activity. So it's not something that you necessarily just think we need to do this quickly. That's not a sufficient emergency. But there may be, if you have a natural disaster or something like that and you need to make a decision on acting on it, that would be an emergency. And then at that point, for the media, you only have to give them the same notice that you give to the actual members of the governing body. So if a member of the council only got 6 hours notice, you need to give the media that same amount of notice, okay? As far as the public, you post a copy of the notice in the location of the meeting or in the courthouse as soon as you possibly can, preferably the same time you're giving notice to the other entities. Okay, here. What is the method of notice to the media? You can do it by mail. You can do it by electronic mail. You can do it by fax. They may tell you how they prefer it, and that's fine. You may also adopt a policy to provide additional notice to the public by electronic means if you so choose. This first one, I question how practical that may be, and it says an email notice can be sent to any person who has requested notice annually by December 31st. So if a citizen, just like the media, gives you a written request by the December 31st of this year, if you have a policy, they can't just do it if you don't have the policy to do this. But if they were to give you notice, then you have to notify them electronically of every meeting. And I don't know how practical that is. Somebody may have an example. Maybe there's not that many that ask for it, so it's not that hard. But I think the next way might be, if you're looking at a policy, is to post the notice on the governmental entity's website. And that's an easy thing to do. You can let the public know that by, at least 48 hours in advance, notices of meetings are always posted on your website. And you can do it that way. And I think that seems a little more practical to me. Minutes or memoranda. At a minimum, memoranda have to be kept of all meetings, including executive sessions. And it tells you exactly what the memoranda, the minimum amount of information is, the date, time, and place of the meeting, what members were present, what members were absent, the general substance of the matters, not a recitation of everything you discussed, and then a record of all votes taken by individual members' roll call. So that's the minimum amount of information that has to be kept on each meeting. Okay? The memoranda are required to be available within a reasonable period of time after the meeting for purposes of informing the public. And Luke, I don't know have you had any complaints that refer to, like, it's taking too long to get the minutes posted, things like that?
That's a pretty regular complaint. People want them almost immediately, and the law says just within a reasonable amount of time to develop those, which would it also include draft minutes or recording of minutes as well? Is there a question there?
That was my question. If you're recording it and it's immediately available, you can take a little bit more time maybe with the written.
Yeah, I don't think there's any set time necessarily to get pen to paper of a meeting, but just in the regular course of business as it becomes possible. If there's a recording of a meeting though, and someone asks for the recording, they should be able to get a copy, pretty quickly and pretty easily.
Yes, sir.
Recording of the executive session?
No, just a regular meeting.
A public meeting.
Yeah, I'll say right now that executive session should never be recorded under any circumstance. Because then it becomes a
Correct.
public record and defeats the purpose of
Correct.
having the executive
No
session.
minutes or memoranda for executive session?
You have to have at least a memoranda, which we'll get to. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about executive sessions because that's always a hot topic. But at a minimum, you keep memoranda, you have to make them available. If you do full minutes, if any, they are to be open for public inspection and for copying. That gets into the public records access, and you can charge, I think, a small fee, et cetera, but that's not what we're here to talk about. As far as minutes, they can be more summary related. Some do record them, and they're more verbatim minutes. I had somebody tell me that the State Board of Accounts more recommends less, more of a summary than a verbatim, but I don't know if that's true or not. But that's something I've been told.
I've been told that as clerk treasurer in my previous life, so yes.
Okay.
When it's Wikipedia,
If you didn't hear that, this gentleman has been a clerk treasurer of a municipality in the past, and he was told that more of the summary is what they recommend to them. They don't want the full dicta, they just want a summary of what happened. So executive sessions. So as we said, the main idea is open and accessible meetings of the open door law, but the main exception to that is executive sessions, and you can imagine there are certain topics and subjects that really should not be discussed in front of the public, and we're going to get into some of those. But an executive session, remember I said it's still a meeting. It's just a meeting in which you exclude the public. If you're meeting about particular topics that we're going to talk about in here, there may be people outside of the governing body that you want to receive information from with respect to that, and you can let those people into the executive session. It doesn't have to be just the governing body. Public notice is still required via posting and notifying the media, but the notice also, along with the date, time, and place, when it's an executive session, it also has to state very clearly the statutorily permitted purpose for doing the executive session. So usually in your 48-hour open door notice, there's actually, they actually recite the code site to the exception, and then the actual language in the code of what that exception is, and they don't go any further into that. Just stating really what is the exception, so the public knows what you are talking about. On the executive session, it does still require that memoranda be kept, and we told you what the minimum is on the memoranda. The memoranda is the date, time, and place, who was present, who was absent. Obviously, there are no votes can be taken in an executive session, so you won't be recording any roll call votes. No other topics other than what you said in your open door notice can be discussed. That has to be also indicated in your memoranda. But your memoranda of an executive session also has to include a certification that you did not talk about anything else other than the specific statutory exception that you said you were going to talk about. So just because you've given notice of an executive session, and let's say it's for the potential purchase of land, and now you're in executive session and somebody says, well, hey, we also have this going on. Let's go ahead and talk about that. You are not supposed to do that, and you actually have to certify that you're not doing that. You would have to do a second executive session with a separate notice that indicated what that exception was. So why can an executive session be held? What are some of the reasons? If it's authorized by federal or state statute, obviously other than this open door law statute, there are some hospital corporations and some other obscure to us statutes that do specifically authorize meetings that are not open to the public for certain topics. And so that would be an example. If it's authorized by another statute, then that's okay. For discussion of strategy with respect to any of the following: initiation of litigation or litigation that is either pending or has been threatened specifically in writing. So it's either that the county is considering initiating litigation against a party, or you have pending litigation that you need to discuss that's already been filed and you need to discuss it, or it's been specifically threatened in writing. So it's pretty narrow. It can't be that you think Joe is going to sue you for a particular issue because he told you that on the street. It has to be actually threatened in writing or be pending. Obviously, collective bargaining. Those are sessions that can be in executive session. The purchase or lease of property by the governing body up to the time that you would actually approve the purchase price, or an option to purchase. Those have to be done in a public meeting. You cannot discuss that outside of a public meeting. Continuing on that, obviously, things to do with employees or potential employees, those are not open to the public, nor do I think they should be from a policy perspective. If you're going to receive information about and interview prospective employees, that is a proper executive session. With respect to any individual over whom your governing body has jurisdiction, if there's alleged misconduct, if there's a determination as to the individual's status as an employee, all of those things are proper executive session topics. When you're considering the appointment of a public official, when you're developing the list of prospective employees and you're considering applications, you can do that in executive session, and you can make one initial exclusion of prospective appointees from further consideration, but then after that, any interviews of prospective appointees, not employees. An example, if you set up a redevelopment authority, again, I'm talking about my municipal finance side, those are appointed by the executive, so those appointments would have to be done in public, but they're not employees of the county. To discuss job performance, evaluations, those types of things, those can be done in executive session, but when you are talking about salary and compensation, fringe benefits during the budget process, that is in a public meeting. That has to be open to the public. And any discussion of records that are classified or confidential by state or federal statute. And again, there's some specific ones with respect to those types of records. This is one that I think from an economic development perspective, and that's something I do a lot of, this is one that I think gets utilized in the early stages of potential incentive projects. Interviews and negotiations with industrial or commercial prospects or agents of industrial or commercial prospects by an economic development commission or the governing body of a political subdivision. So if you have a company, obviously when they're coming in and they're doing site selection and they're looking at your potential county for them to locate their fantastically large manufacturing plant, you don't have to hold those initial discussions and things in the public eye, because obviously that is going to damper that company's desire to even look at your county because they don't want their name out there. So there's some fine lines when it comes to economic development, and I know a lot companies do not want their names out there and being discussed in public that they're looking at a potential location in your county. So there are certain, you want to stay on top of any discussions to get to a point where at some point it does become public, and then those discussions are in public meetings and things like that. So, but that's one that you can certainly start initial discussions in executive sessions. You have any thoughts on that, Luke? You get complaints about economic development?
When you notice that meeting,
Uh-huh.
and you try to keep who you're dealing with secret, you have to put the name of who you're
No.
dealing with, or just
No, what I would do in that 48-hour notice, I said in the back here that you have to give the specific reason that's permitted, that it's a permitted executive session. So what I would do is I would cite the code site that says that industrial or commercial prospect, and then I would use that exact statutory language, that this is being held to discuss or negotiate with, and I would use that exact same language and not say anything about they're a manufacturer, they're a food processor, wouldn't say anything else except exactly what the statute says. And that would be sufficient. So, yes, ma'am.
Is the auditor supposed to be in attendance at an executive session with commissioners or council?
Yes. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the auditor is the secretary.
Right.
And so they need to be in both public meetings, they or a delegate, in
Right.
public meetings or an executive session. Remember, we talked about that certification or attestation that the only thing discussed was what was on the notice. A separately elected official kind of acts as the checks and balance on that statement. And I've seen this unfortunately too many times where a group gets behind closed doors, talks about whatever they want under the auspice of a specific executive session justification, where they really just found an opportunity to get behind closed doors and legally talk. But, you know, especially in counties where you don't have opposing political parties on the same governing body, there's really no one else to keep them accountable other than a separately elected official who's, you know, that's not necessarily their job. It's just an additional layer of protection for the public.
Any others? Okay, this is a question that I think we're getting more and more of. I don't know if Luke's office is, but what about participation by electronic communication in this world of technology? And we're all busy. We can't always be in the same place at the same time. I'm a council member, I'm a commissioner, can I participate via telephone or computer or video conferencing or any other electronic methods that are available these days? The statute says you can. However, you may not vote on the matters, and you cannot be considered present for quorum purposes. So basically, you can hear the information, you can provide information if you have information, but they have to, in order to take any votes, that governing body would have to have a quorum without you, without the person that's there by electronic means, and also whoever's there by electronic means cannot vote on that issue. Okay? There are some statutes that specifically allow electronic participation. One of those is redevelopment commissions. So if you have a redevelopment commission member that wants to participate electronically, they can do that. There are some requirements, though. Members of the public who are physically present at the meeting must be able to and the member that is there electronically must be able to simultaneously communicate with each other. So that does not mean an email situation. So conference phone, video phone, something like that, where a member of the public, if they're being allowed to provide comments or ask questions, could hear a response from the member that's there electronically. That would be okay. In that situation, though, at least 1/3 of the members of that body would have to actually be physically present. So you couldn't have, you know, half of, well, you could have half. You couldn't have, you know, 4/5 of the redevelopment commission there electronically and one member sitting in the room with the public. So that's not allowed. This member can vote, and they can be considered for quorum purposes, but I think that's where that simultaneous communication ability comes in. Whether or not that'll ever get extended to other governing bodies like the commissioners and the council, I don't know. It's fairly new for redevelopment commissions, though. I think that's only been in the last couple of years. Yes, sir?
Just because maybe I'm just not understanding this correctly, but on that last phrase, back there, it says at least 1/3 of the members must be physically present. Down below it says the members shall be considered present for the purposes of the statute.
Yeah, the 1/3 requirement is actually physically present in the room. So for that 1/3 requirement, the member on the phone, if that's the media we're using, is not considered for purposes of counting the 1/3 requirement, because that's a physical attendance. But for purposes of whether there are 3 out of the 5 present for purposes of conducting a meeting, they can be considered present. So if you had 2 members of a 5-member redevelopment commission there, that physically present in the room where the public is, that would meet your 1/3 requirement, okay? But it doesn't meet your quorum requirement, but you have 1 other member on the phone, so now you have 3 that by statute are considered present for quorum purposes and may vote. So are you understanding the distinction? A physical attendance in the meeting room versus by phone. There are 2 requirements. Does that make sense? Anybody else? It is very hot in here, isn't it? Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
40%.
Yeah. It's 40%. 2/5 is,
A third.
2/6 is a third. So it is. Whatever the math works out, you have to make sure you've got at least 1/3 of that governing body present. I'm into words, not numbers, but, you know. Okay. So now we're going to get really even more into, I think, Luke's side of the coin here. What are the remedies for violations of open door laws? Yes, ma'am. Do you have a question?
Yes, we had a council member ask if we could call into an executive session. He said no, because we couldn't tell who else was in his, like, office, a closed session. But
Yeah.
electronically, is there, on that, I mean, is there?
No, not technically. I mean,
Did everybody hear that question
Yeah,
really
the-
quick?
The question
Okay.
was, okay, can a council member call into an executive session? The danger being that those present in the room wouldn't know who's on the other line with that council member. The executive session law says that anyone may be present in the executive session that contributes to the discussion. So you can have outside members of the public, of other governing bodies, in an executive session. You can invite anyone who effectuates the conversation itself. It doesn't really talk much about exclusion of anyone. So in your scenario where someone is called in and there may be, 3 people huddled around a conference line in an office remotely, that's more of an internal governance, internal policy type issue. The open door law doesn't really address it. It's
Seems
more of a-
very reasonable
more of a
that you would
practical
not.
consideration. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Until there's a technology that allows you to know exactly who you're dealing with and who's in the room, I would think that makes sense as a policy decision. So remedies for violations of open door law. Obviously, any person can file a lawsuit, and many do occasionally on different issues. But what are the remedies if they are successful? One is they could obtain a declaratory judgment to really keep you from continuing these types of violations, future violations, those types of things. If you're holding executive sessions on a particular topic and they file a complaint and the judge or the court or the office of the counselor determines that public was correct, then they can stop you from holding executives. They can try to stop you, I guess, from holding executive sessions on those types of topics. They can have a policy decision or final action that was taken in violation of the open door law declared void. So from my perspective as a municipal finance lawyer, if there was a complaint filed or a suit filed that said the county council improperly voted on a bond ordinance, and it come to find out that that was true, that would be a big problem for me as the person who gives the final opinion that those bonds are valid and binding. So we get local council opinions that say they followed the law when it comes to open door law, all those types of things, public hearings, notices, et cetera, because when you have an action considered void, that can have a big impact on other actions that have been taken subsequent to that. So you're going to see some timeframes here, which is also good, some more limitations. So a lawsuit must be filed before any bonds or short-term notes are issued, and that's to protect a potential bond purchaser who didn't know, because there was no complaint ever filed, and the local government said they did everything right, and so all those certifications are in place. And so we go out and sell those bonds, and somebody buys them, and they've given you their money, and you're using it on a project, and then somebody from the public comes and complains and wants to void that bond ordinance. The courts have said no to that. So that at least protects, if you get to that point, That's kind of a statute of limitations. Within 30 days of the occurrence of the action, or no later than 30 days after the person knew or should reasonably have known. As far as knew or reasonably have known, let's say you get your minutes finally posted to your website. That I would think that would trigger a point where the public, the 30 days would start when the public could reasonably have known what was going on in that public meeting. So that might be one example. I don't know if you have another. A court can take a variety of actions. They can take into account the severity of the violation, whether they thought the violation actually prevented the public from fully understanding the policy or decision, or whether the public interest will be served by a remedy. So it's not just black and white. They can look at all those different things, because sometimes there may be a kind of a technical violation of the open door law that really did not hinder the public's ability to understand and know what was going on, but they wanted to file a complaint anyway. So the court can look at all of those types of things, as can the public access counselor. Civil penalties, this is relatively new, I believe. There can now be civil penalties for a public agency and an officer or management level employee of a public agency. They can be subject to civil penalties if the officer or employee, with specific intent to violate the open door law, fails to give the proper notice of certain meetings, takes final action outside a regular meeting, participates in secret ballot votes, discusses subjects not eligible in executive session, or fails to prepare a memoranda of the meeting. And for the first offense, it could be up to 100. I don't think when this first came out, it actually had the amounts in it. And I think that was a concern for a lot of people. But up to the $100 for your first offense and up to $500 for each subsequent offense. So I think this probably is harder under the Access to Public Records Act, but as far as open door law, I think it's pretty specific here what actions could get you in trouble with respect to civil penalties. But again, it has an intent component to it. Yes, sir.
Is there any action or state statute that you have an opinion on going the other way? Frivolous open access complaints?
No, there's no statute that that would cover it. We don't process those complaints. We weed them out. We apply pretty strict scrutiny to those complaints, make sure they're meritorious. I'm sure a judge would do the same thing. If it doesn't have a cause of action or grounds for a complaint, then it's going to be thrown out. Sometimes without, on our end, sometimes without even involving a response from the public agency.
Yeah, and I think if someone repeatedly was filing those types of claims, I think you could look under the trial rules, and a litigator could probably be filing some kind of frivolous lawsuit against them. But that falls under a different, it's not really under open door law. Okay. Public access counselor powers and duties. We kind of talked about this in the beginning, but you'll see a couple slides on the public access counselor's duties. At this point, I think they have lunch starting to be set up, so I'd like to just go ahead and take any questions that we might have or any additional comments that somebody might want to make. Yes, sir.
Questions whether a fair board would fall under this, and if they're a instrumentality of the county, they would be. And if it's just a ad hoc volunteer group, no. But if it's established and or funded by the county, yeah, a fair board would qualify.
They're all volunteers.
Doesn't
Well-
matter if they're elected or appointed.
Right.
It can be appointed as well. Yeah.
The question was whether a fair board might fall under this. And if they're given authority to take action on county business, such as county fairgrounds improvements or activities, then I would think the liberal construction would say you lean towards their being open to the public.
If they're exercising a, some kind of authority or duty of the county otherwise, then yeah, they would be.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What kind of documents do you have to give to the public that are at your meetings?
What kind of documents do you have to give to the public at your meetings? This kind of strays a little bit into the public records discussion, but anything, you have to provide any public record that is not declared off limits by statute. So if someone asks for a board packet, for example, if there's no sensitive information in that board packet, the entirety would have to be given. If there is sensitive information, it can be redacted or withheld, but there would be a statute that would address those materials.
Yeah, and that's a whole workshop in itself, access to public records.
Yes.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What if, when we have this happen in our county, two people can have a private conversation in an open meeting?
So a meeting within a meeting, basically?
Yeah.
Depends what the makeup of the board is. If there's 7 members of a county council and 2 of them are kind of having an offline discussion at the end of the table, well, technically, that's not a majority of the board, so it's not a meeting. But I have heard of scenarios where everyone's on their texts, under the table, texting each other in a group message type situation. Well, then, yeah, you're having a meeting within a meeting, and that should be considered
That's a
off
violation,
limits,
right.
yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there a time requirement for when minutes should be posted?
Reasonable time is all that the law says.
If there have been like 3 meetings since the last time minutes were posted online, that's probably not reasonable.
Correct. They should be
Yeah.
ratified at the subsequent meeting, and if there's amendments at during the ratification process and they have to go back the next month, well, maybe 2 is okay, but 3 would be probably one too many.
Excessive, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Is there a recording requirement for a caucus?
I could spend another hour on caucuses, but no, there isn't. Caucuses aren't open to the public. It
Right.
just, the question is what qualifies as a caucus.
As a caucus, right.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, it's, okay, so say you have a 7-member board.
Yeah, they wanted us to elaborate on the definition of serial meetings.
Say you have a 7-member board, and you don't have the opportunity to meet as a majority, but you still want to get together to discuss it. And so 3 people meet one day to talk about this specific issue. The next day, 3 more people meet, and then that 7th person meets with 2 from the first group, and it's kind of like a round robin of public officials meeting. That's prohibited under the serial meeting statute, so you can't get around the law by having those
smaller.
types of smaller meetings. And there's some temporal and spatial elements to that requirement too. It's within a week's time.
Right, 7
It's
days.
about the same subject. So it's not, forever you can't have these smaller meetings. It's just within a week, about the same thing. And the intent can't be to avoid the open door law requirements.
And I'm just to end with that, I'm going to give you the code site so you could actually look that up specifically on serial meetings because it is defined and there's a laundry list that Luke basically went through. It's Indiana Code 5-14-1.5-3.1. So you could look that up and print that off and it'll talk about what is a serial meeting. Okay? Any other questions? I see the Grand Poobah in here, so he's probably wanting to hook. Yes, sir. One more.
Clarification on that last point, one person could call 6 other people on the same board, and that would not be a serial meeting, correct?
I'm going to put Luke on the spot on that one.
Technically, that is correct. I would question why you would want to do that and what your intent was. But yeah, technically you can. You can have individual conversations as much as you want.
Okay, I think we're out of time, and I think lunch is ready. So, David, do you need to make a comment?